If the policy of shielding the nation from reality, maintaining morale by avoiding the truth, and convincing the public that the war was being conducted by a command of geniuses could have been typified in one area and by one commander, that area was the Southwest Pacific, and that commander was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942 after a dramatic escape from the Philippines to be commander-in-chief of the Allied armies there. Newspapers in the United States headlined MacArthur's arrival and the fact that Roosevelt had given him command of a mighty American army assembling in Australia to drive the Japanese back to Tokyo. MacArthur's appointment as United Nations commander for the South Pacific and the knowledge that American troops are here in considerable strength have brought the first sure hope of victory, wrote a Chicago Sun's correspondent, H.R. Knickerbocker, from Melbourne on March 18, 1942. The United States is in the war with all its power and under the leadership of the best general that the United Nations possess. The facts were somewhat different. There was no great army, the commander of the Allied Air Force, General George Brett, reported, and the Air Force consisted of a few battered planes and combat-weary men. Of the 11 divisions of the Australian forces, less than 2 divisions were effective troops. One was in approaching combat condition, and the rest were composed of militia, at that time in a very indifferent state of training and equipment. The Royal Australian Air Force was equipped with almost obsolete aircraft, and was short of engines and spare parts. The Royal Australian Navy did not have a single aircraft carrier. In short, MacArthur reported to Roosevelt on May 8, 1942, "At this time there are present here all the elements to produce another disaster." It was no news to Roosevelt. In the spring of the previous year, before Pearl Harbor, Anglo-American staff conferences in Washington had decided that if the United States entered the war, the Allies would first concentrate on the defeat of Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill, at a meeting after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, confirmed this decision. Even if it meant the temporary loss of Australia, until victory was assured in Europe, operations in the Pacific would have to be conducted with the limited resources available. So much for the myth of the mighty army awaiting MacArthur. What of MacArthur himself, the best general that the United Nations possess? The best that can be said of his record in the war to this stage is that it had not been very impressive. 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese carried out a successful attack on Clark Field in the Philippines. Although MacArthur had adequate warning, the Japanese caught his heavy bombers parked wing to wing on the ground, refueling, and wiped them out. MacArthur never made a satisfactory explanation about this defeat. Part of the problem was that 3 different plans existed for the defense of the Philippines, and MacArthur followed none of them to its entirety when the war started. There then followed such recriminations, arguments, and discord between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy over who had been responsible for the debacle that relations remained soured for the rest of the war. MacArthur's communiques from the Philippines maintained the cheerful, optimistic strain that had been so misleading to Washington before the war with Japan, and his news releases bore so little resemblance to what was actually happening that they aroused resentment among the troops. "Help is on the way from the United States. Thousands of troops and hundreds of planes are being dispatched." He created around himself the legend of a military genius aloof from the day-to-day conduct of the war, busy with matters of strategic importance. Although no one questioned his bravery, he spent so much time underground in the fortress on Corregidor that he became known as Dugout Doug. Fresh from the worst defeat American arms had ever suffered, Was MacArthur the best general the United Nations possessed? A highly skilled public relations team, under MacArthur's personal direction, set out to make this true, and there remains the ironic possibility that MacArthur did eventually expand to fill the role his publicity created for him. He began brilliantly by announcing, on his arrival in Melbourne, "I have come through and I will return," tidied up by his publicity staff. This became, "I shall return," a historic wartime slogan, which not only was repeated in correspondence dispatches on every possible occasion, but was also printed or stamped on thousands of match folders, blotters, buttons, and cakes of soap that were then dropped on the Philippines. Never one for understatement, MacArthur addressed Australian leaders in Canberra, telling them, "We shall win or we shall die. To this end I pledge you the full resources and the almighty power, all the blood of my countrymen." He made the first public appearance wearing 36 metal ribbons, 9 rows of decorations, and his personal photographer, who had orders always to get the best profile, took pictures of him hard at work on his campaign. At the same time, aided by the Australian authorities, he established almost the tightest censorship of any theater of the war. Joseph C. Harsh of the Christian Science Monitor, who had been with the German army in the early months of the war, complained to the Australian government that censorship in Australia was stricter than in Germany. He ruled that any correspondent who interviewed any member of the Allied forces would be banned from advanced bases, and that the soldier would be court-martialed. All dispatches had to pass through MacArthur's headquarters, no matter where they were lodged, and submission to one censorship authority did not exempt the correspondent from obtaining clearance from any other censor whose service might be involved. So then, for instance, Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbor. Correspondence stories had to be cleared by the Garden Island Naval Base, Sydney, the Navy Board, Melbourne, MacArthur's General Headquarters, and Commonwealth Security, Canberra. One reason for such strict censorship was to avoid the alarm and despondency that would have resulted if the correspondents had got to hear of and tried to publish the plans MacArthur had approved to defend Australia from Japanese invasion. Western Australia and everything north of Townsville would have to be surrendered, Perth and Darwin to be left to their fate, because there were simply not enough troops to hold them against a determined Japanese assault. The First Army was to defend the coast from Brisbane to the Victoria border. The Second Army was to provide local protections for Melbourne, in case the Japanese should be so foolish as to land in the sparsely populated northern part of Australia. Groups of scorched earth troops were stationed there, with secret orders to wait until the wind was in the right direction and start gigantic brush fires, one of the more bizarre war stories still not fully known even today, at the time of writing. Since citizens in those areas had to be abandoned to the Japanese, might have shown some resentment about this plan if news of it had leaked out, care was taken that it did not, even to the extent of deliberately not withdrawing those troops that were already there. This was done, as the army coyly put it, for reasons of moral and psychology, but none of this emerged until after the war. But another reason for the strict censorship was to control the image of MacArthur as projected by correspondents. On October 2nd, 1942, MacArthur flew to New Guinea, where a Japanese attempt at invading Milne Bay had been repulsed by Allied troops, the first land operation to take place under MacArthur's new command. The visit was heavily covered. One Australian officer said that he had not known that there were so many photographers in the world, and American, Australian, and British correspondents lodged with the censors 25,000 words. A day later, The correspondents were told that the stories had not been sent because they had said, correctly, that it was MacArthur's first visit to New Guinea. The correspondents learned what was expected of them when, 5 days later, with the stories still not sent, the British correspondents withdrew theirs on the grounds that the visit was now stale. They were thus able to see the changes MacArthur's censors had made. Walter Lucas of the Daily Express had written, General MacArthur has returned from his return visit to New Guinea. The censor had crossed this out and substituted, General MacArthur has been seen at the front in New Guinea. When the correspondents protested that their stories were being doctored to create a false impression, the censors cut the 25,000 words down to 10,000 and released them a week after MacArthur's visit. We are concerned here not to assess MacArthur's status as a military commander, but to look at his influence on the way the war in the Pacific was reported. Due to his total control over correspondence in the area, no one attempted an assessment of how the general's carefully fostered image measured up to reality, or of how his communiques compared with the truth. So in 1969, Gavin Long, a correspondent who later became an editor of the Australian official history of the war, wrote of the downright mendacity of MacArthur's communiques and suggested that the strategy that won him so much renown, of bypassing enemy strong points and leaving them to, quote, wither on the vine, end quote, originated with the U.S. Navy and was imposed on an unwilling MacArthur by his superiors in Washington. Yet the fact remains that MacArthur not only returned to the Philippines, but went on to Tokyo, and that there is no evidence that, even in the darkest days, he ever doubted he would. When Noel Monks decided that censorship and Hollywood-style publicity of MacArthur's command were not for him and that he was going back to London, MacArthur sent for him, as he did every correspondent who wanted to leave his theater, and tried to dissuade him. "You're going away from the big front, the big war, son," he said. It must have caused MacArthur some chagrin that what appeared to be the first striking victory against Japan came at sea. This was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval action in history in which surface ships did not exchange a single shot. The battle was fought entirely in the air, and its significance was reported by the Chicago Tribune's correspondent, Australian-born Stanley Johnston, who was on board the American aircraft carrier Lexington until she sank. Johnston wrote that the battle showed how completely the carrier had displaced the battleship in importance in modern war. Johnston's considered conclusion was virtually overlooked in the euphoria. The Americans had sunk the escort carrier and damaged another, so the result of the battle was about even, but it was presented as a major American victory and the saving of Australia. Quoting figures that bore no relation to reality, the New York Times of May 9, 1942 said, Japanese repulsed in Great Pacific Battle with 17 to 22 of their ships sunk or crippled. Japan also claimed the battle as a victory. The Japan Times, an advertiser, going right overboard with its headline, U.S. Panic-Stricken. True, the troop convoy escorted by the Japanese naval force, heading for Port Moresby in New Guinea, turned back, thus lending credence to correspondents who wrote that the battle had saved Australia. The fact, although of course not known then, was that the Japanese did not intend at the time of the Battle of the Coral Sea to invade Australia, because they were incapable of doing so. The Japanese Navy had wanted to occupy such key areas as Sydney, Brisbane, Townsville, and Darwin, but the Japanese Army had said that this would require 10 to 12 divisions and that it could not risk moving so many troops from Manchuria and other occupied areas at that time. Even a compromise plan to isolate Australia by cutting her supply lines from the United States was postponed, in favor of a large-scale attack on Midway, the fortified American atoll protecting Hawaii. If there was a single battle in the Pacific that turned the war in America's favor, it was the Battle of Midway, the first decisive defeat inflicted on the Japanese Navy in 350 years. It was one of those rare battles in which a numerically inferior fleet, in the space of only minutes, snatched victory from a stronger force and changed the course of history. For the loss of one American carrier and 147 aircraft, the United States Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 destroyers, and several transports. The result was that Japan had to restrict her plan to isolate Australia, yield the Central Pacific to United States, and go on the defensive. As well as being a great strategic victory, the battle produced notable exploits of victory and self-sacrifice on both sides. An American torpedo squadron went into attack without fighter protection and lost every plane and every man but one. A Japanese carrier captain refused to leave his bridge, armed himself to prevent any of his crew from attempting to remove him by force, and went down with his ship, singing calmly, Kimigayo, the national anthem. Yet, the watershed of the war was the worst reported naval battle in the Pacific. The first attempt to tell the American public about it almost resulted in the correspondents being charged with espionage, and it was months before anyone would believe that Midway was a victory at all. The battle was fought June 4th, 5th, and 6th in 1942. There were no American correspondents present, but during this period, Stanley Johnston, the Chicago Tribune correspondent who had reported the Battle of the Coral Sea, was en route for the United States on a naval transport after his rescue from the Lexington. Sailors on the transport had heard of Johnston's rescue work when the Lexington went down, and they went out of their way to be friendly with him. They spoke freely about the reports coming in of a battle raging around Midway. On arrival in Chicago, Johnston sat down in his office and wrote what he had learned. Then, with Wayne Thomas, one of the Tribune's staff, he went through Jane's fighting ships and roughed out the likely composition of the 2 opposing fleets. Finally, a brief communique from the Navy announcing the bare details of the battle and estimated Japanese losses enabled Johnston and Thomas to set out with remarkable accuracy an account in which they gave the order of the battle, Japanese fleet in detail. Through an oversight, Johnston had not been asked to sign accreditation papers as a war correspondent and attached to the Navy. Therefore, he was not bound to submit to the naval censors everything he wrote. There was nothing in the censorship code for newspapers that prohibited the disclosure of the names, movements, or location of enemy vessels, and so the Tribune went ahead and published Johnston's story on its front page on June 7th. It created an uproar. Johnston and Thomas were immediately summoned to Washington and interrogated by Navy Department officials. Johnston freely revealed his sources and said that he was bewildered about the fuss. All he had tried to do was tell the American public about a great American victory. Next, a special federal grand jury was appointed and asked by the Attorney General to carry out an investigation into the story, with a view to discovering whether to carry out an investigation, an indictment should be preferred against Johnston on charges of violating the Espionage Act. President Roosevelt was accused of using the case as a means of punishing the Tribune and its owner, Colonel Robert R. McCormick, for the neutralist views they had expressed before the war. Nevertheless, the grand jury's investigation, the only one of its kind during the war, went ahead, but found after 2 months that there were no grounds for issuing an indictment. For Johnston, it could be said that the damage had already been done. Contrary to the usual custom, the grand jury had revealed Johnston's name and the nature of charges being investigated, and linking of a war correspondent with espionage allegations could not help his reputation, no matter what the grand jury eventually found. It was not until the end of the war that Johnston learned the real reason the Navy had tried to punish him. The Navy had known of the movements and composition of the Japanese force at Midway because it had been reading the Japanese codes, and it was worried that the accuracy of Johnston's story would make the Japanese realize that their codes had been cracked. It did not, but American censorship rules were now extended to restrict all material about enemy as well as friendly ships, and relations between the Navy and Johnston remained bitter for the rest of the war. And, probably because of the Navy's reaction to the Tribune story, editors, politicians, and the public discounted further reports about American successes at Midway as being exaggerated, so that for months its significance went unnoticed. Not until Robert J. Casey, a war correspondent for the Chicago Daily News, published in late 1942 his book Torpedo Junction, recording the rise of the United States Navy from a disaster of Pearl Harbor to its triumph only 6 months later at Midway. One of the greatest maritime battles in history was the importance of the battle at last recognized. So much information had been suppressed that Paul Scott Maurer, of the Chicago Daily News editor, complained that even in the spring of 1943, the general public is not clear whether the Coral and the Midway battles were different or the same. Clearly, American correspondents had fared badly in the early part of the war in the Pacific. As the United Press reported later, the swiftness of the Japanese conquest in Southwest Asia, the dire plight of the United States Navy, and the blanket of censorship and propaganda that covered military operations made the first months of 1942 a nightmare of confusion for correspondents at the fronts and editors at home. But British correspondents and their theaters did little better, despite a credible start. 2 British correspondents and 1 American were on board the battle cruiser Repulse when she and the battleship Prince of Wales were sunk by the Japanese in the Gulf of Siam on December 10, 1941. Churchill had sent the 2 British ships to the east in pursuit of his personal strategic fantasies, that it should be possible to bluff the Japanese out of the idea of war altogether, or, if that failed, then persuade them to attack the hard-pressed Soviet Union. So 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the 2 most effective ships in the British Navy were blundering about in the Gulf of Siam within easy reach of Japanese bombers and without any air cover. The 3 correspondents, O.D. Gallagher of the Daily Express, Cecil Brown of the Columbia Broadcasting System, and Lieutenant Tubby Abrams, an official Navy photographer, had a close-up view of the worst individual disaster that the Royal Navy suffered during the war, and one of the heaviest setbacks to the Allied cause in general. As Yukio Waku, war correspondent for Yomiuri, reported, "We succeeded in locating the Prince of Wales and the Repulse a few miles off of Kuantan. Our formations of bombers fell on the 2 capital ships amidst anti-aircraft fire from the enemy. Our torpedoes hit their mark with incandescent glow of flashing amid dark smoke columns. In disorderly wakes ran the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, and in a moment they came into the columns of fire, going to the bottom." End quote. Down below, all 3 correspondents survived the sea and the oil, but until they were picked up by destroyers. The notes Gallagher and Brown had taken also survived, and back in Singapore, each wrote his story and got it away without difficulty. "We were able to tell the truth because it had been for ourselves that it happened," Gallagher has recalled. "There were no public relations officers to gum things up. Because the Royal Navy was such a mess, no one had any time to think about correspondence and their stories. Gallagher's story was the front page lead in the Daily Express and dominated the rest of the paper. Brown's dispatch was broadcast 5 times in a day. As a result of their first-hand experience of Japanese fighting qualities, Gallagher and Brown were now better placed than most other correspondents in Singapore to assess the base's chances of resisting a Japanese attack. Both they and Ian Morrison, the Times of London's correspondent, who was the son of Chinese Morrison and lived and worked in Japan, soon became very pessimistic, while those correspondents who had no reason to doubt British officials' statements that the Japanese could not be taken seriously soon became, as the army commander, General Arthur Percival, reported, wholeheartedly behind the war effort, and sent home reams of soothing nonsense. Singapore, nerve center of Britain's defensive system in the East, is sharpening her teeth, wrote Leonard Mosley of the Daily Sketch in a dispatch typical of reports at the time. Giant guns guard jungle-fringed shores. Australian, Britain, and Indian troops on the high-flying-infested forest are ready for anything, while clouds of planes daily patrol over neighboring islands. Mosley and his colleagues can perhaps be forgiven for misleading reporting such as this, because they, in turn, were misled by the Ministry of Information and by service officials who genuinely believed that Singapore was an impregnable fortress and that the Japanese were incapable of efficiently waging war with Western interventions like battleships, tanks, submarines, and aircraft. The truth was that Singapore was virtually defenseless, and when the Japanese army came cycling down the main roads of Malaya, Singapore began to fall apart. The city was bombed, but there was no one on duty to sound the sirens, and the street lights remained blazing because no one could find the keys to the master switch. The post office cut the telephone circuit to the front line when the regulation 3 minutes were up. A last-minute attempt to build defenses on the island was delayed 10 days by an argument over the correct wage to pay the coolies. The secretary of the golf club insisted that no guns could be mounted on the links until he had consulted the committee. Airfields had been built without any consultation, often could not be defended by the army, and like everything else, had to be abandoned on the run. British troops retreated from positions and the Japanese were not attacking, disobeying orders to counterattack, and failed to follow up advantages obtained by the rare ambush. Morale collapsed and deserters poured into Singapore to add to the chaos. In the end, on February 14th, 1942, a British army with ample munitions surrendered to a Japanese force, barely 1/3 its strength, and down to its last 100 rounds of ammunition per man. The correspondents must accept some of the blame for the shock that the fall of Singapore caused. Once the myth of the Fortress of the East was established, once the impenetrable jungle, with its crocodile-infested creeks, was firm in the reader's mind, it was difficult to erase. To their credit, a few correspondents tried. Theodore White wrote for Life in July 1941 an article saying that in the event of war, the Japanese army would attempt to take Singapore by fighting its way down the coast of Malaya. Cecil Brown constantly inveighed against British complacency, and for his pains had his accreditation temporarily taken away from him. O.D. Gallagher attacked the "it can't happen here" attitude of the Singapore civilians, but they were all up against powerful pressure from the Ministry of Information to put out the official view. Gallagher wrote later that each week the official bulletin announced the arrival of yet more reinforcements. "We reporters had to cable these bulletins to various parts of the world. Reinforcements were arriving almost weekly, but their arrival did little more than build up an army of reasonable size. Obviously, we were unable to explain this in our cables, and the result was that the world in general was given the impression that Malaya, and particularly Singapore, was receiving all the attention it rightly deserved. The shock of its collapse was greater than it need have been. Once the Japanese began their drive down the peninsula, correspondents were largely dependent on the official communique, which was remarkably uninformative. When formation after formation of Japanese bombers dropped stick after stick of bombs across airfields, destroying bombers and fighters on the ground, this was described to the correspondents as, quote, the enemy endeavoring to gain a measure of air superiority, end quote. When groups of correspondents were sent to the front with the conducting officer, the only stories they could hope to get were interviews with junior staff officers who tended to describe what would turn out to be a decisive engagement as a spot of bother, or stories of the bravery of British troops in retreat. Ian Morrison soon realized that this sort of reporting failed to convey what was really happening in Malaya. I sometimes wonder, he wrote, if a correspondent does not do a disservice to the general cause by recounting these tales of personal heroism, which are so eagerly read by the people at home. The tales are often so stirring that they clamor to be written, but when things are going badly, do they not sometimes obscure the main issues? After his escape from Singapore, Morrison succeeded in publishing his view of the debacle. If the British ran the rest of the empire as they had run things recently in Singapore, then they did not deserve to have an empire at all. But Cecil Brown told the American public on his return that censorship had done everything possible to hide the real situation. O.D. Gallagher, whose book Retreat in the East, written in 1942, attacked the guff of the propagandists at Singapore, went to see then Minister of Information, Brendan Bracken, to ask for more paper so that his publisher could meet the wide demand for a reprint of the book. Bracken cut short Gallagher's pleas with, "You don't really expect me to give you paper to print a journalistic attack on the British government, do you?" Yates McDaniel of the Associated Press, who had been the first American correspondent to arrive in Singapore and was the only one left to witness it fall, he got out the last boat and turned up in Batavia on February 20th, a week after a wild adventure, captured in his dispatches the apocalyptic, almost surrealistic nature of the Malayan disorder. 3 days before Singapore fell, for example, he wrote a report describing how the white population still firmly refused to believe that it was all happening. In front of the Raffles Hotel, cars are depositing patrons of the daily tea dance, and outside the theater people are queuing up to see Joel McCrea and Ellen Drew in the film Reaching for the Sun. On February 15th, there were only Japanese correspondents and cameramen around to record the British officers in their baggy shorts and faintly absurd toothbrush mustaches, signing the surrender and agreeing that British troops would help the Japanese maintain order until the occupation could be completed. This orderly handover of power from one imperial regime to another, marked by a display of friendly relations between many British and Japanese soldiers, was the most costly and humiliating defeat in the history of the British Empire. White supremacy had ended, and nothing in the East could ever be the same again. 2 months later, Churchill, who had ostentatiously taken responsibility for the disaster, was apparently so ill-informed as to its causes that he was unable to explain it to the House of Commons. It was not until the enormously detailed and admittedly nationalistic Australian and New Zealand war histories appeared after the war that the awful truth at last began to emerge. Only in the late 1960s and early 70s, with a spate of histories, memoirs, and biographies, was the full story finally begun to be told. In Burma and India, the authorities had no intention of allowing correspondence to record what looked as if it could be the early collapse of the British Empire. Not only was there the question of trying to maintain morale, but there were political considerations as well. The British war aims were to restore everything to the way it had been in 1939. The Burmese were witnessing the Japanese drive the British out of Burma. They would one day witness the British, preferably unaided, drive the Japanese out. So the British administration looked without favor at two Chinese armies, led or advised, no one ever made it clear, by General Stilwell, trying to stem the Japanese advance. Without any effective overall command, everything went wrong. The Chinese were short of ammunition and supplies, yet, as everyone in Rangoon could see, the docks were choked with American war medals. O.D. Gallagher, fresh from Singapore, and Leland Stowe of the Chicago Daily News tried to send this story, but as soon as the censor learned the subject of their messages, he refused to even read them. F.W.R. Stone of the Rangoon Gazette, probably realizing that he would lose his newspaper anyway, and that there would be little the censor could do to him, wrote the story under the headline, "Faith in our fighting men, but protect us from non-belligerent dopes." The British abandoned Rangoon, destroying valuable oil installations. 11 million pounds worth went up in flames in 70 minutes, and set out on the long retreat to India. The British authorities ordered all correspondents to leave, and from then on, reports of what was happening in Burma came from official communiques issued in either Delhi or Chongqing. These were interpreted by correspondents in the best possible light. The newspaper readers in the United States and Britain could be forgiven for believing that the Japanese were receiving a lesson they deserved. One headline read, "Chinese cavalry routs Jap panzers in Burma," and while Stilwell was making a forced march to India through a great stretch of jungle bound by the Irrawaddy River and the Himalayas, Americans were reading, "Invading force crushed by Stilwell, and Stilwell's China's troops trap Japs. Invasion army in full retreat." Stilwell's own comment when he met correspondents on arriving in Delhi, "I claim we got a hell of a beating," came as a refreshing shaft of honesty. One correspondent told the truth as he saw it. Jack Belden, a young American adventurer, a romantic and idealist, had jumped ship in Shanghai in 1933, roamed around China, and joined the United Press after the Japanese invasion. He had gone to Burma with Stilwell for the time and accompanied Stilwell on his forced march, but before leaving, he managed to get off a series of short messages on the last aircraft to India. He began, "This is probably my last message," and ended, "Must go, goodbye." In between, although he complained that everything was happening so quickly he could not write a coordinated story, Belden set out what had gone wrong in Burma and the lessons to be learned. It was a first-class piece of war reporting, and a period of fantasy and self-delusion. In the middle of this low point in Allied fortunes, there arrived in the India-Burma theater one of the English eccentrics whose activities cannot help but be newsworthy, and whose value to the war as morale raisers is beyond calculation. Ord Wingate, like Lawrence of Arabia, his distant relation, had unorthodox views about how wars should be fought, and in early 1943 he led his Chindits, a special force of some 3,000 men, on a guerrilla-type operation hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines. 3 months later, only 2,187 returned, and of these no more than 600 were ever fit for active soldiering again. The mission had no strategic objective, except perhaps to exhibit British activity and to demonstrate that the Japanese were not invincible in the jungle, and the official army historian decided after the war that the results achieved by Wingate's special troop were intercommensurate with the forces diverted to it. But from a public relations point of view, Wingate was a godsend. A British force had engaged the Japanese on their own ground and had had a measure of success, the only success at that stage in the whole of the Far East. So when British correspondents in India went among the survivors and collected their stories, the army did not need much prompting to issue a communique and raise censorship to allow the whole episode to emerge. It made an immediate and enormous impression, especially on Churchill, who was drawn to Wingate as he had been drawn to Lawrence. The publicity storm grew in strength. Photographs of haggard Chindits in tattered tropical uniform and Australian slouch hat were all in the newspaper, and Wingate himself, an old-fashioned pith helmet and thick dark beard, became a British hero overnight. Mastery of the jungle. Unforgettable adventure, the Times said. Other newspapers described Wingate as a genius and the operation as the greatest jungle epic of the war. The Royal Central Asian Society awarded Wingate its Lawrence of Arabia medal, and Churchill had him flown back to Britain, and then took him along to the Quebec Conference to meet President Roosevelt and the American chiefs of staff. The extremes to which British correspondents had gone to glamorize Wingate created a public appetite for more, and when he returned to India to organize a second Chindit expedition, the army worked out an elaborate plan to make it the most of the publicity. The idea was to put out colorless reports to begin with, followed by more detailed ones as public interest was excited, moving towards a climax of sensational dispatches beginning, "Now it can be revealed." No one told Wingate this, and when the early press releases from the Southeast Asia Command headquarters on the second operation made no mention of the Chindits of Wingate, but of troops of the 14th Army, Wingate was furious and protested to Lord Mountbatten and later directly to Churchill. Churchill replied, promising to mention the Chindits and their commander in his next broadcast to the nation. On March 24th, 1944, before Churchill's message had reached him, Wingate and two British correspondents, Stuart Emery of the News Chronicle and Stanley Wills of the Daily Herald, were in a Mitchell bomber that crashed in the Assam hills. They were all killed. The place Wingate and his Chindits deserve in the history of the war against Japan remains a subject of debate, with Field Marshal Sir William Slim of the opinion that the press excitement over the expedition was its only justification, but blame for the over-glamorizing of a comparatively minor and very costly operation in the Burma campaign must lie almost entirely with the correspondents. As it turned out, Wingate and the Chindits were on the journalistic high point in the India-Burma theater, and the heavy hand of the censor settled on most other aspects of the war there. Unrest in India was largely responsible, and the fact that the British no longer trusted the will of the Indian army to fight for the empire. Officers learned by rumor, by whisper, by secret briefing that the Japanese were raising an army of Indian prisoners of war to march against the British and were calling on patriotic Indian soldiers to turn on their officers. This was a traumatic shock which haunted the British throughout the war. "We all knew about it," the Indian war correspondent Frank Morris said, "but no one tried to write about it. No one dared." Eventually, Blitz, a weekly paper started by the Bombay War Publicity Committee, revealed the existence of the Indian army raised by the Japanese under the heading, "This Quisling Army." The editor, R.K. Karangia, told me that the headline made him ashamed. But how else could I have got the story out? He was prosecuted under the Subversive Publications Act, but was acquitted. The highly sensitive area made censors overly security conscious, and the story of Douglas White shows Wilkie representing a group of Australian and British newspapers, including the Evening Standard of London and the Herald of Melbourne, made a 2,000-mile tour of the India-Burma Theatre in 1943. During his tour, Wilkie wrote 12 articles describing his experiences and assessing the state of the campaign, and sent them back to Delhi for the censor to handle and cable to his newspapers. On his return, Wilkie found that the censor had stopped 3 articles completely and had sent the others only after cutting them so heavily that they did not make sense. My final picture of one of the world's main battlefronts was in large part frivolous references to elephants and tribesmen I had interpolated in more important material. Wilkie wrote to the Director of Army Public Relations, "If war correspondents are to be allowed to write only what the military wants, then would it be easier if you confined your publicity to official handouts? It's my concern that every sense in my professional reputation should be endangered because of my editor's compulsory ignorance of your censorship policy. My articles, as dispatched, are not a fair index of my industry, views, or conception of the functions of a war correspondent." Wilkie delivered this letter. Then, as a protest in which other correspondents should have joined, he packed up and went home.